I'm glad to be here and to explain to anyone interested a little bit about what the priorities of the uh, legislature's climate solution, Vermont Climate Solutions Caucus, are for the upcoming legislative session and perhaps immediately beyond that. Our caucus has been meeting. We meet during the session every week, but we took the unusual step this year after the session ended of having an all-day meeting, breaking up into separate working groups in different areas around subject areas around climate change, and we have been actively meeting and have come to a pretty close to a consensus on what the real sort of banner pieces of legislation are that we would support and that we'll be working for, and that people will be able to see that we are doing something dramatic. With that said, it's important to understand that in the legislative process, a lot of what happens does not happen in those big bills. For instance, we did a fair amount in the last session. I agree that it wasn't enough, but we did a fair amount in areas of weatherization, in transitioning to electric vehicles, carbon sequestration, and things like that. And those were all in separate bills that were worked on by various committees. Didn't all come out in one big bill. And whether or not all of these big banner bills get through both houses of the legislature and get signed by the governor, it's important to remember that if we're really successful, then almost every committee in both the House and the Senate are going to own a piece of dealing with climate change, and every year, year after year, are going to be working on the nitty-gritty part of implementing this. So with that said, I'll start by reminding people that when we're talking about energy use in Vermont, in predominantly a rural state, there are three types of energy use in the big picture. One is energy sources as well. One is electricity and all the things that we use electricity for. That is actually, of these three areas, the smallest source of energy consumption in Vermont. The next is thermal, which is energy used for heating, for space heating, as well as for other types of heating, cooking, commercial and industrial uses, things like that. And that's a pretty big one. And the third, and by far the largest use of energy and of carbon footprint, is transportation. And that's because in a rural state, without a lot of alternatives, people do end up driving longer distances than if they lived in the city. So the first bill that was introduced in the last session, there's a version in the House and there's a version in the Senate. In the House, it's in the committee I'm on, which is the Energy and Technology Committee. We took some testimony on it in the last session, but it did not, no action was taken on it yet. And I strongly support this bill. I do think it will need some changes before it passes, but this will be an important priority for us. The Global Warming Solutions Act, its intent is to take the very ambitious and wonderful goals that Vermont set for itself around renewable energy and greenhouse gas emissions, but which we have not been meeting, and particularly with greenhouse gas emissions, as has been in the news, we're going in the wrong direction. The emissions are actually growing some. It's to take the goals and make them requirements that state government must see that these things are implemented to achieve these goals. Realistically, we think that given the fact that time has passed and that we've actually in that time gone backwards into in terms of carbon reductions, we would set our goals to be the same as the goals in the Paris Accord, the international agreement around climate change. And a reason for that is it's strategic. We want this bill to pass. And we want to have as many people be able to support it as possible. And in this case, Governor Scott has in the past said that he supports achieving the goals as set forth in the Paris Accord. So that's what I think in terms of a consensus that members of our caucus have come to, that's what we would be saying is a requirement. We would want to achieve net zero by 2050. That means net zero means that even though there will still be emissions, we will still be even burning wood and some fossil fuel. We will be doing things that offset those emissions, like reducing conservation, alternate forms of transportation, carbon sequestration through forestry, things like that, so that the goal is to achieve a net zero carbon emission. We will be emitting some, but we'll also be doing things to essentially negate those emissions. We want this to be enforceable by Vermonters. We want it to have the potential in the bill to incorporate the principles of Green New Deal. And by enforceable, we're mirroring what some other states have done, including Massachusetts, with making these goals mandatory, which it will allow if the state of Vermont is not achieving a particular goal, it will allow citizens and others to take legal enforcement action, civil action, not criminal action, but people could bring suit against government and say you're not meeting the requirements that are in the law. To sum that up, we want to make sure that every aspect of state government is working on this. We're talking about transportation, environment, agriculture, utilities, state buildings, the state fleet. Every part of state government is doing its part in terms of its own operations, as well as the different regulatory and enforcement responsibilities that various agencies have, whether it's the Agency of Natural Resources, Motor Vehicles, the Public Utilities Commission, that they are all doing what needs to be done to make these goals actually happen. So that's the Global Warming Solutions Act. I've said elsewhere, and I still believe this is a heavy lift. It's a very significant bill. There's cost to it, and I will be working to get it passed. But it will take a lot of effort to get enough votes in both houses of the legislature to get it passed, and also hopefully to have it signed into law by the governor. The next banner issue is called the Transportation Climate Initiative. This is something, it's a program that's a compact among 12 states in the Northeast and East, and some southern states heading south of what we call the Northeast. 12 states have agreed, they agreed a couple of years ago to work to see if they could come to an agreement about a cap and invest program. And I'll try not to get too technical about this, but it follows a model that's actually been in effect and that Vermont has been participating in regarding electric utilities and their carbon emissions, called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. this would be for transportation. And what it does is it creates an allocation, a cost per ton of carbon emissions for transportation-related fossil fuels, that is assessed not at the local distribution level. It's not assessed on local gas stations or convenience stores. It's assessed at the level of distribution of the people that import these fuels into Vermont, and that the funds that are raised in that way are spread across the entire region. It's a regional thing. It's not something that's on Vermont or any other one state. The funds that are assessed and collected are then distributed back to the states to use in transportation activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, this has been working on the electric generation side. We first agreed to enter into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in 2005 or 6, I believe, and it was Governor Jim Douglas that moved this forward at that time, and it was implemented also during his administration. It started operating in 2008. And Vermont's share of the funds that get raised have gone to do very good things in Vermont in terms of energy efficiency in particular. This is a similar concept. And what the legislature's role is, first of all, the legislature needs to approve and authorize Vermont entering into this regional compact, assuming that proposal does come forward. I'm hopeful that it will, because the administration, the Scott administration, has actually invested a considerable amount of time and energy in working with the other states on this, and has assigned Peter Walk, who is the Deputy Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, to be the lead person for all of state government on this, and he is presently kind of all over the state talking about this. So I'm hopeful that this will move forward. When the legislature does act on this, one of the things we need to do is to sort of put some guardrails and parameters around how the funds that Vermont receives will be used, so we make sure that it's actually doing the right things in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and also that it's not simply replacing funds that the state of Vermont is already spending on these things. So if the state of Vermont is giving incentives for people to buy electric vehicles, we don't want these new funds to simply replace that in the budget. We want to see these funds spent in addition, on top of what the state has already committed to doing using our own revenue sources. And another idea that has come up, because the funds that come into Vermont will come in relatively small and modest amounts. So the question is that enough to actually is there enough money coming in any given year that you can actually do something really bold and meaningful? And it's been suggested, and I think this is worth looking into, that the state could issue what's called revenue bonds. They can essentially borrow based on the expected revenue and income coming from the TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, and in other words, get a significant amount of money up front, so you can really do some bigger and dramatic things rather than in dribs and drabs. So that's the Transportation Climate Initiative. Next is is it really in the area, it's kind of in the area of workforce development around buildings, homes, businesses, industrial buildings. And we're talking about thermal energy now, primarily for heat. We want to see legislation as needed to ensure that frontline workers who actually meet and talk with and work for Vermonters are in the vanguard in promoting and helping people play their part in meeting our greenhouse gas goals. So people who are building contractors, plumbers, heating and air contractors, electricians, appraisers, real estate agents, home inspectors, all of those people deal with the building stock in the state of Vermont, and we want to ensure that they are educated and know about the state goals, can support them, and can assist Vermonters in making choices that will meet those goals, whether it's someone buying a house or renovating a house or a business property. Many of the types of professionals that I just listed are already licensed by the state of Vermont. They need to be approved and licensed and qualified by the state of Vermont. So it's thought that that could be the connection to them, to engage them, and for starters to get themselves voluntarily certified that they are knowledgeable about greenhouse gas emissions and reduction. And I've talked mostly in this case about buildings, but the same goes for transportation. We want car salesmen and mechanics and service people who are working on automobiles to be knowledgeable, to be enthusiastic, and to promote electric vehicles. It's felt for a while, this may be changing, that car dealerships were so used to selling the cars that they've always sold and didn't know much about electric vehicles, didn't know whether there was a market and whether people wanted to buy them. That's changing. And so people who are working in the automotive fields need to change and help us promote these changes in transportation. Lastly, without getting too technical, in the regulated utility field, utilities have a requirement to meet certain increasing percentages of renewable energy in their mix, but there are 3 tiers of measurement in that. The first tier is renewable energy from anywhere that can either be in Vermont or imported from the region. But what we're really looking at now is tier 2 is a separate tier with a requirement to have as much small in-state renewable generation as possible. And we want to continue to work to remove the barriers for those kinds of projects to go up. This would be mostly solar, but not limited to that. We want to make sure that that the built spaces in Vermont, that means rooftops, parking lots, and places that already have construction on them, that we can fill those spaces up with solar panels without needing to take up any significant amount of additional land in doing that. Not that we shouldn't do the latter, but certainly it seems like a no-brainer to put panels wherever we can on the built landscape in Vermont. And then we want to streamline the tier 3 that utilities are required to meet, is to work on reducing carbon reductions from fossil fuels, which is not necessarily utility generated, but to help people. It could be home weatherization, it could be incentives for purchasing an electric vehicle. A number of utilities are doing that. Each utility has designed its own programs based on their territory and who their customers are and things like that. And I think there's a feeling that we'd like to see a little bit more coordination, not necessarily that everything is standardized from utility to utility. And speaking of utilities, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but it is important to note that while we're not doing as well as we need to be overall in greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, when it comes to the electric utilities in Vermont, we first of all have 3 utilities in the state that are already 100% renewable in their energy portfolio. That's very significant. And the largest utility, Green Mountain Power, presently is, I would say, considerably more renewable in its power supply portfolio than most utilities in this country, and has recently very publicly committed to getting to 100% in the relatively near future. That's a big effort for a larger utility to do, but they have made that commitment. So when it comes to our sources of electricity, we're not that there isn't a lot more that we can do, but we should recognize that the biggest and most difficult part of what we need to do in Vermont is in the thermal and transportation areas, and that's why we've devoted that much attention to it. So that's really what we call the banner pieces of legislation are that the Climate Solution Caucus would like to be working on. But as I said right at the beginning, it's important to recognize that I think you're going to see, if you really follow this year after year, a number of different committees dealing with different areas and subject matters and programs are going to be doing their own, I'm going to say, nitty-gritty work on this issue. And the example I give is every year the legislature has to pass a big transportation bill. It contains all kinds of stuff about transportation and highways and public transportation and what have you. And this past year and going forward, there are lots of provisions in there about wrestling with the questions of how we're going to charge for electric vehicle charging. How do you pay for that? How do electric vehicles, now that there's a really noticeable number of them, start contributing to highway maintenance like every other vehicle does? And questions like that are technical, complicated, but if we have to resolve these in order to really move the big issues forward. So I'll finish with that.